welcome to another episode of the Chaos Chronicles. I'm Jess, and I am back again with Ruby, and we are here for another true crime episode. Before we dive too deep, though, make sure that you're following us on all of our social media platforms. I do have those linked down below for you guys. Also down there is our email, so if you have any ideas for any episodes, feel free to shoot them our way, or even if you just want to say hi, that would be awesome. One of the more recent episodes that I uploaded was the case of Elisa Lam. And during that, I talked about Jack Unterweger and how he did some of his killing at the Cecil Hotel. So today we are going to be talking about him. Trigger warnings for today's episode include violence, sexual assault, and murder. To begin, Johann, nicknamed Jack Unterweger, was born on August 16, 1950 in Dudenberg, Styria, in Ally-occupied Austria. The country was still reeling from the aftermath of World War II, and Jack, as he would come to be known, entered the world under less than ideal circumstances. His mother, Teresa, was a barmaid and waitress for Kaltenfurt, and she had a documented criminal record involving fraud, theft, forgery, and other petty crimes. She was actually in and out of jail around the time of Jack's birth, and he would later claim in interviews and his autobiography that his mother occasionally worked as a prostitute. The Austrian judicial records do not back up the prostitute convictions, and Teresa pushed hard back on this, saying that her son invented or exaggerated the story to make his book more sensational and to paint himself as a tragic victim. Jack's father's identity was murky from the start. Teresa claimed that it was an American GI named Jack Becker, a soldier that she met in Tracy, Italy in 1949, and she gave her son the nickname Jack because of this. Some accounts suggest that the father might have been another American soldier, Donald Van Blarcom, who she later married. Jack himself would sometimes waver on who he believed his real father was, once saying that he thought he resembled Donald. Less than a year after his birth, in January of 1951, Teresa was imprisoned again for a prior fraud conviction. Now, Jack, as a baby, was placed with a foster mother for about a year, and then around the age of 2, he was handed over to his grandfather, Ferdinand Weiser, and Weiser's partner, Maria Springer, in a remote wooden lodge in Peacefog, Carinthia. This is where Jack's own story starts to diverge sharply from the accounts of neighbors and relatives and official records. And I do want to interject, a lot of this is not English names, so apologies in advance. I will try my best. In his autobiography and interviews, Jack painted his grandfather as a violent alcoholic who dragged him along on thefts of farm animals, brought strange women home, and forced young Jack to watch them have sex. He described a childhood filled with neglect, abuse, and trauma. Here's where it gets a little complicated. Government records, neighbors, and even Springer's adult children who lived with them contradicted much of these claims. They described his grandfather as a man in poor health, partially paralyzed in the face, nearly blind in one eye, deaf in one ear, suffering from emphysema and bronchitis. Apparently, he didn't get out much. And the family said that Jack was cared for, though perhaps not ideally. Some suggested that young Jack had a tendency to manipulate situations, pitting adults against each other with tattletaling. By the age of 8, after Springer left Weiser, Jack bounced around again to a great aunt, more foster homes, and eventually an evangelical reform school in Treffen between 1962 and 1965. At the age of 16, he dropped out of school and bounced through several hotel waiter apprenticeships, often getting fired for stealing. This got him into juvie, and from there it was a revolving door of more thefts, more burglaries, and increasingly violent behaviors. By his late teens and early 20s, the pattern was clear. Between 1966 and 1974, he racked up at least 16 convictions, mostly property crimes at first, but they quickly escalated, and there were reports of pimping, physical assault on women, and sexual violence. In the summer of 1969, he was sentenced to 4 months for burglarizing a kiosk. In 1970, 7 months for kidnapping a minor from her legal guardians, combined with theft, and then he was sentenced to an additional 3 months after he sent a threatening letter from prison to another woman. Then came 1971. In Salzburg, Jack approached a sex worker named Monica H. He lured her into his car, drove her out to the remote moors outside of the city. Once there, he struck her in the back of the head with a metal rod. He stripped her naked, tied her up using her own underwear, and then sodomized her with a rod while he masturbated. Monica somehow survived and alerted passerbys, and Jack was arrested. While in custody, he actually attempted suicide by overdosing on sleeping pills. This got him transferred into a psychiatric unit, and he was actually released without facing the full weight of consequences for this. Some later reports even suggest that the dates or details were sometimes conflicted with another assault on a teenage student named Daphne, showing how his early crimes became blurred together in the records. Later that year, he went to West Germany, only to be detained for vehicle theft and transported back to Austria, where he served another 15 months. In April of 1973, 23-year-old Yugoslavian woman named Marcia Horvath was found murdered. She had been bound and gagged with pantyhose and strangled with a distinctive necktie. The tie had been purchased in Wells, where Jack was living at the time. He was arrested and questioned. There wasn't enough physical evidence to hold him, and his underage girlfriend provided an alibi, and this case was dropped. Just months later, in October of 1973, Jack picked up a nurse named Maria W. as a hitchhiker in Kitzbühel. He drove her toward Oberndorf and then suddenly stopped and began punching her while trying to rape her. Maria fought back, escaped into the woods screaming, and eventually got him to drive her home. She reported the full story at the hospital, and during interrogation, Jack admitted to beating her, but claimed that the rest was consensual. Again, the case was dropped. By 1974, Jack was in an abusive relationship with a woman named Elizabeth L. in Rohrbach. He beat her, sexually assaulted her, threatened to abduct and disfigure her child if he spoke out. Later that same year, he physically assaulted 2 more women and knocked out one of the woman's teeth. He moved to Switzerland with another underage girlfriend, Annalise E., working as a disc jockey and waiter. There, they met Barbara Schultz, a young West German woman who had become entangled with him. Barbara and other teenage girls were allegedly involved in financing his lifestyle through prostitution. Jack was no longer just committing crimes of opportunity. He was now targeting vulnerable women, using charm mixed with sudden violence, and manipulating those around him, especially young girlfriends, to cover his tracks. On the evening of December 11th, 1974, Jack and Barbara broke into Barbara's parents' home in Ewersbach. They were burglarizing the place when 18-year-old Margaret Schaefer, a friend of Barbara's, unexpectedly walked in and caught them. Instead of panicking, Jack and Barbara convinced the teenager to stay quiet. They persuaded her to get into the car with them, and after stopping to steal more money from another apartment, the group drove off. They pulled into a parking lot where Jack overpowered Margaret. He tied her up and stole her wallet, promising that they would release her outside of town, but they had no intention of doing that. He stopped the car near a forest outside Herborn. Leaving Barbara in the vehicle, Jack marched Margaret into the trees. The next part is a little graphic, so if you want to skip forward a little bit, that's totally fine. He beat her repeatedly with an iron bar. He tied her up using her own pantyhose. He raped her with the weapon and then manually strangled her to death. After she was dead, he covered her body with dirt and leaves. In a final act that would become his signature, he tied Margaret's bra around her neck post-mortem. In early January of 1975, Jack, Barbara, and Annalise E. committed yet another robbery at a jewelry store in Ewersbach and fled to Switzerland. Running low on cash, Jack called Annalise's parents and demanded ransom for her return. Police were waiting at the arranged handover in Basel. On January 17, 1975, Jack was arrested for kidnapping. He was extricated back to Austria. While in custody, authorities connected him to the murder of Margaret Schaefer, and Barbara Schultz was charged as an accomplice. In July of 1975, Jack was convicted of 4 counts of rape and assault from his earlier crimes between 1971 and 1974, receiving a 3-year sentence. Then, in June of 1976, he stood trial for Margaret Schaefer's murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. Barbara received 8 years as an accomplice. The Marcia Horvath investigation was effectively shelved once he was locked away for life. Now, in prison, Jack did not just sit still. He taught himself to read and write more formally and began producing poetry, short stories, plays, and essays. He edited prison literary magazines, and most importantly, he wrote his autobiography that I cannot pronounce because it is not in English, but it translates to Purgatory or the Trip to Jail. It was published in 1983 and became a surprise bestseller in Austria. In it, Jack presented himself as a tragic figure, abused, neglected, and a product of a failing society who has seen the error of his ways. He wrote very eloquently an apparent raw honesty that everyone ate up. They saw in Jack proof that the system could work, and that even the worst offenders could be redeemed through art and reflection. Prominent people began visiting him in prison. Letters of support started to pour in. His poetry and plays were performed outside the walls, and one of his works was even adapted into a movie. Jack became a minor celebrity while he was in prison. He gave interviews, and some compared his writing to that of other imprisoned authors who later gained freedom. The narrative formed was, "Look what rehabilitation looks like. Jack is living proof." Not everyone was convinced, though. Police officers like August Schiener, who had investigated earlier cases, tried to warn authorities. They remembered the pattern. They remembered Marcia Horvath, but their voices were largely drowned out by the wave of intellectual and media support. By the late 1980s, a full-blown campaign was underway to get Jack paroled. Intellectuals, artists, and journalists lobbied hard. They argued that he had served enough time, shown genuine remorse, and contributed meaningfully to society through his art. In 1990, after serving just 15 years of a life sentence, Jack walked out of the prison a free man. The intellectual elite of Austria celebrated him as a triumph of rehab. He was living proof that even the darkest souls could be redeemed through literature and reflection. Almost immediately, Jack embraced his new status as a celebrity. He appeared on talk shows and gave interviews where he spoke about his past crimes, his remorse, and his journey toward enlightenment. His book had already been adapted into a film, and he was now in demand for speaking engagements, literary events, and journalism assignments. He settled into a life in Vienna, dressing sharply, charming everyone he met. He cultivated relationships with influential people and wrote plays that were performed. He worked as a journalist, often focusing on crime. To the outside world, Jack was the ultimate success story. A former murderer turned poet, playwright, and crime reporter. He had money, attention, women, and respect. He traveled, he enjoyed the nightlife, and presented himself as an intellectual and reformed man. But the cracks were already starting to appear. Not long after his release, there were reports of assaults and disturbing behaviors toward women. Police and some investigators quietly kept an eye on him, but the weight of his popularity and the narrative of redemption made it so difficult for those concerned to gain any traction. Jack had learned in prison how to manipulate the public perception. Now, as a free man, he weaponized that skill on a much larger scale. He was living a double life. Within months of his release, Jack resumed killing. Between 1990 and 1992, he is believed to have murdered at least 9 to 12 women, possibly even more. His victims were primarily sex workers. His method was consistent: strangulation using the victim's own bra, stocking, or underwear, often tied with distinctive knots that would later become his signature. In Austria, a series of murders began in the Vienna woods and surrounding areas. Women were found strangulated and dumped in the wooded locations. The bodies were often partially hidden, naked, or partially clothed. Ligature marks were unmistakable. Austrian police started referring to the perpetrator as the Vienna Courier or the Forest Killer because of how the bodies were left. Jack, meanwhile, was working as a crime journalist, sometimes even reporting on these very murders. He would visit crime scenes, interview detectives, and write articles expressing outrage while secretly being the one responsible. The killings were spaced in such a way that Jack could maintain his public persona between them. But he did not limit himself to just Austria. In Czechoslovakia, at least one murder was later linked to him through similar methods. And in Germany, additional cases showed the same pattern. But then, in 1991, Jack traveled to the United States. He was in Los Angeles on an actual journal assignment, writing about the red light district and comparing them to those in Europe for Austrian media. Between June and July of 1991, 3 women were murdered in Los Angeles in a manner identical to the European killings. Shannon Exley, age 35, Irene Rodriguez, age 33, and Peggy Jean Booth, age 26. All 3 were sex workers, and all 3 were strangled using their own undergarments with that same distinctive knot. Their bodies were dumped in areas that matched Jack's signature disposal method. Jack later checked into the Cecil Hotel. And yep, this is the same hotel that I referenced in the Elisa Lam case. After the Los Angeles murders, Jack returned to Europe, continued killing, and even reported on the growing panic about the Vienna Courier. The total known victims during the spree were at least 9 confirmed in the trial, with strong evidence for more. He crossed borders deliberately, knowing that it would complicate investigations. He used his journalism credentials as a perfect cover, traveling freely and asking questions about the crimes he himself had committed. By late 1991 and into 1992, Austrian police could no longer ignore the obvious. The new wave of prostitute murders matched Jack's 1974 killing of Margaret Schaefer in almost every detail: the ligature, the knot, the body disposed in wooded areas. Veteran investigators, including August Schiener, pushed hard to reopen files and connect the dots. They began surveillance on Jack, and they tracked his travels. International cooperation became crucial, especially with American authorities after the LA murders. Evidence was starting to pile up. Witness descriptions from survivors and associates, fibers, hairs, and trace evidence linking scenes to Jack. His travel records placed him in the right cities at the right times, and the distinctive knots matched across continents. In early 1992, Jack fled Austria and made his way back to the United States, eventually reaching Florida. On February 27, 1992, he was arrested in Miami. The FBI and local authorities worked with Austrian police to extradite him. Even after arrest, Jack continued his media game. He gave interviews from custody, proclaiming his innocence and calling on his friends for support and playing the role of a persecuted artist. He maintained his charm even behind bars. The extradition process took time, but eventually Jack was returned to Austria to face justice. The investigation had been a masterclass in international police work at the time when DNA technology was still emerging. What tied everything together was not just forensics, but the behavioral pattern, the signature, the mobility, and the arrogance that made Jack believe that he could get away with it. Jack's trial began in 1994 in Graz, Austria. It was a media spectacle. The once celebrated literary figure now stood accused of multiple murders across continents. The courtroom was packed. Reporters from Austria and abroad covered every moment. Prosecutors presented evidence linking Jack to 9 murders, 5 in Austria, 1 in Czechoslovakia, and 3 in Los Angeles. They highlighted the identical strangulation method, the use of the victim's own bras and underwear, tied with that now famous knot. They showed travel records, witness statements, forensic links, and the chilling overlap between his journalism assignments and the locations of the killings. Jack maintained his innocence throughout. He continued to play the role of the misunderstood artist, claiming that he was being prosecuted because of his past. His supporters tried to rally behind him, but the evidence was overwhelming. On June 28, 1994, the jury found Jack guilty on 9 counts of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The reaction in the courtroom was one of relief mixed with shock. For many, it felt like justice had finally caught up with a man who had manipulated the system for too long. But the story wasn't over. That very night, just hours after the verdict, guards found Jack dead in his cell at Graz Carlo prison. He hung himself using a cord made from his shoelaces and the drawstring of his tracksuit pants. He had tied the noose with the exact distinctive knot that he had used on all of his victims. Under the Austrian law at the time, because he had expressed intent to appeal and the verdict had not gone through the full confirmation process, his conviction was technically not considered fully binding after his death. In wake of his death, Austria was left reeling. There was a widespread embarrassment among the intellectual and media circles that had championed him. Questions were asked about the parole system and about how a convicted murderer could so thoroughly fool so many educated people. Books were written about the case. Psychologically, Jack is often described as a classic malignant narcissist and organized serial killer. He had high intelligence, superficial charm, and a complete lack of empathy. He was able to compartmentalize his life perfectly, loving the adoration of high society while simultaneously destroying lives. His case raised uncomfortable questions like, how much do we project our hopes for redemption onto charismatic criminals? What are the limits of rehabilitation? How does media glorification enable monsters? And can someone truly change after committing horrific violence? Jack's international killing spree also highlighted challenges in cross-border investigations before modern DNA databases and better international cooperation were fully in place. Some researchers do speculate that he may have even killed more than the 9 that he was convicted of, but we will never fully know that, unfortunately. And that is what I have on Jack Unterweger. Thanks for hanging out with us. And I do have Bear here too. He decided to join maybe halfway through. You can kind of see him in frame if you guys are watching. But thanks for hanging out with us. And I will see you next time for who knows what. Bye.